Live in about 5 seconds. Okay, we're live.
Thank you, Zach. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of What's a Tea at South Suburban Family Shelter, where we stream every Tuesday at 2 p.m. So please bring your tea and join us for some pretty good conversations. So we usually talk about different topics. Today, we're going to talk about traditional masculinity, and we're also going to cover some of the dangers that might bring. So we do encourage any comments. We encourage any questions that you may have. Go ahead and leave that in the comment section. We're going to have designated time at the end of this episode for those questions. And we're going to do the best we can to answer those. I do have the honor of having a guest speaker here with us, Jennifer, and she's our executive director. Jennifer and I do share a common characteristic. We're both moms of boys. And so this is a topic that kind of is just very meaningful to both of us. It was something that I was looking forward to because the more I can learn, the better, because we are raising boys. And so I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself, Jennifer.
Oh, hi, everyone. Happy to be back on What's the Tea again. I'm Jennifer, the executive director here with South Suburban Family Shelter. Looking forward to this discussion with Celeste and approaching it from the perspective that we bring.
Yes. And thank you, Jennifer, for being here with us. I know our viewers have seen you here before.
Yep.
So I'll go ahead and jump right in. So feminism, that has opened up a lot of possibilities for what it means to be a woman. So in history, in the past, women weren't allowed to do a lot of things. We weren't allowed to vote. We weren't allowed to go to school. We weren't allowed to basically do what we wanted. And that has changed a lot, as we all know it. But what's new about what it means to be a man? How has that changed?
So that's the question, right? And I'm not entirely sure what's new. I think I probably made some assumptions about what might be new or what might be different in terms of things being more open. So, right, this idea of girls and women can only do or be certain things has really kind of exploded and shattered to a certain extent over the years. And I think it's the next step to say, well, sure, that's happened for boys too. And in raising a boy, I've kind of been wondering about that because my son at least, right, is relatively kind of a stereotypical boy. He likes the things that you would think of when you think of what boys like. But one thing that I've noticed, just even in children's clothing, like a lot of t-shirts and accessories for girls that have these sort of empowering statements on them, and nothing like that for boys at all, which I thought was interesting. I didn't know whether that was a good or a bad thing, but I just noticed that it was pretty different. And so my son is now annoyed with me because occasionally I ask him questions about what it's like to be a boy. But it stands out to me that he will tell me that girls can pretty much do anything. Girls can do things that he thinks of as boy things, right? But boys are not allowed to do things that he thinks are girl things.
Okay.
And I have thought that maybe that would be different.
That's very interesting. That's something that I'm definitely going to keep my eye out for because I don't really shop for girl clothes. So I haven't paid attention to that. But yeah, I can see that. I hear that a lot in schools too. Even when I go to present hands are not for hitting to the kindergarteners, they say things like that. Like when I ask them, hands are not for hitting. You're not supposed to hit anyone. And a lot of them think, well, it's okay for a girl to hit a boy, but it's not okay for a boy to hit a girl. And so there's all these stereotypical norms that even the little ones are starting to believe.
Which is interesting because I think you see a lot of headway toward equality, or at least people talking more about equality or more being egalitarian and parenting, or at least that focus and how we as a society raise kids. That was what I endeavored to do, right? As a feminist parent, I was for sure found out I was going to have a boy and felt this immense responsibility as a feminist woman raising a boy. but he's,
Yeah.
he's like any other boy that I would have grown up with, no matter what I've said. I mean, there's I've asked him some questions in prepping for this episode. Like I
Okay.
definitely asked him, like, one of the things that I read. So just so you all know, I'm listening to audiobooks here in COVID times to spend the time and catch up on some work related things. And I came across a particular book that sort of sparked the idea for this episode. And one of the things that the author discussed in the book was when she interviewed young adult and teenage boys, they had a really restricted range for their emotions. It was okay for them to be angry and it was okay for them to be happy, but it didn't really seem like it was okay to be anything in between.
Yes.
So that's the kind of stuff that I was asking my son, because of course, like that's the example that I have to go to. Do you feel, what kind of feelings do you feel? Because that's always been important to me, just like Celeste, you guys teach about feelings
Yeah.
to the younger kids. So that's always been something that I've tried to do. And could he talk about his feelings to other boys, which was another piece that I found very compelling in this book. Was these young adult and teen boys talking to the author about how they couldn't share that type of things with their male friends. So there seemed to be a limit to how far their friendship could go, which is really, it's just so different than being a girl and a woman, because that's who we go to when we talk to people. And
Yeah.
that doesn't seem to be the same. So just all of these like thoughts and thinking about, from the perspective of a mom, what do we need to be thinking about differently or focusing on
Yeah.
in raising boys and young men? Because we're invested in people having healthy relationships. And that means that everybody gets to have a healthy relationship. And
Yeah.
that everybody has a role to play in
Exactly.
what that looks like.
Exactly. Yeah, as they grow up, their teachers, their coaches, everybody really does play a role. And I think it's interesting how you're talking about these mixed messages that boys are getting, where they're getting this message that boys and girls should be treated equally. We should be given the same opportunities, but at the same time, there's all these restrictions. You should be equal, but you can't be like this and you can't be like that, and you have to be this way. And so it could be confusing to them. This could be confusing them even more to hear one thing and then hear something that's almost a complete opposite. So how do you think that this could harm them in their relationships, all these restrictions?
So I think, and I'm just going to be upfront, right? Like I'm guessing because I've never been a boy and I'm not a man. So I can only go so far in my interpretation about this. But what it's really sticking out to me is this sort of restricted range of how to be in a relationship, and really wondering, does that allow, like we've really put so much into girls being able to express the fullness of who they are, no matter what that is. And so what I'm concerned about is that I don't see us putting the same level into boys being able to express the fullness of who they are. And I think myself, at some point for a while, didn't really think about that, because the thought process that I was coming to from my feminist perspective was around privileges, around male privilege and boys and men having certain kinds of privilege. But that gave me a blind side to the full humanity, right, of boys and men. Yes, they have privileges for being a man, just as I, as a white person, have privileges for being a white person. that doesn't mean that then they shouldn't be able to express emotions or have thoughts or work through difficult things or be able to have the tools necessary to unpack what that male privilege means, right? Okay, they have it. So then am I not going to give my son any tools to figure out what that means for him and
Exactly.
his life and the way that he interacts with other people that don't have the same privilege that he has? That wasn't on my radar. I mean, it just prior to, having this boy come into my life wasn't the way that I thought about things.
Yeah, I think I can relate to you with me and my having two boys. I don't have a daughter. I don't know how I would be with my daughter. I want to say I'd be the same way, but who knows, right? But like you said, usually boys do go to women when they want to talk about their emotions. And something really interesting that I read is that sometimes they blame their fathers for this. Sometimes fathers don't, at least as much as their moms, ask them about their feelings and, how are you feeling today and things like that. So a lot of them do blame their fathers or say that, they learned to be this way because their father was this way. And again, you said, everybody plays a role. So here we are as moms, we're doing the best that we can, asking our boys about how they feel, but at the same time, we might not be noticing that the men in their lives aren't doing the same thing. So what message are we sending them? So there's just so much to think about, so many things that could go wrong and could go right in these situations.
Yeah,
But
it's so interesting because we do talk about role models, right?
Yeah.
And I guess one thing that we do know is that when kids are really little, if they've got a mom or a mom figure involved in raising them, they tend to attach to that figure, assuming that the mom figure is the primary caretaker. Typically it is, sometimes it's not. But at some point, kids tend to start to more identify with the person whose gender expression they feel matches their own gender expression. So at some point, I'm starting to see that a little bit, right? Where my son was like all about mom, and now he's almost 10, and it's starting to shift a little bit more to identifying a little bit more with dad, and how that the influence of who it is that they're identifying with, that role model, is an example for them. And I hear men in my life that are my age or older kind of talking about, whether or not their dad was a hugger, or whether or not how their dad may have responded when they cried or got hurt or were sad. And you think about that, and it's could be the same for the moms as well, right? Kids they have needs around their emotions, to be validated and to be comforted. And there's research out there that really has consistently shown that it's much more likely for a girl to be validated and comforted around a difficult emotion than it is for a boy to be validated and comforted around a difficult emotion.
I can
And so
see that.
yeah. And so how is that impacting people? What do you
Exactly.
internalize when you're growing up? And then it plays back into your relationships,
Mhm.
which is where this all sort of comes in, having healthy, full relationships for both partners. And this always, I find that often when we're talking about relationships, we tend to talk about it from this lens of the male part of the relationship is the one that has the potential to be hurtful or harmful.
Yeah.
So what are we putting out there when we talk about that? When that's how we talk about it, that this is the person who has the propensity to be harmful. I feel like we're kind of inadvertently falling
Yeah. We're making it a
back
norm.
into that.
Yeah, exactly. But honestly, I think that vulnerability is just essential in a relationship. So if boys are being taught not to be vulnerable and not to express their emotions, this is something that's just necessary. And one thing that you mentioned before when we were having a conversation is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's actually something that's necessary in a person. And
Yeah,
so how are you going to cut
talk
somebody
about
off from their emotions? when that's something that they need in life. That's something that they need to just form a relationship with somebody.
Absolutely. It's in there. I'm glad that you reminded me of that and brought it up, Celeste, because we put it up on one episode at some point. We were talking, I don't remember which episode it was, but it's human connection is in there somewhere. I'm drawing a picture in my mind, and I think it's sort of like in the middle.
Yeah, exactly. It's in the middle, love and belonging. So friendship, intimacy, and a sense of connection.
Yeah, that sense of human connection. I think we might have been talking about it because COVID is like, severing people's ability to be as connected as they were before. But that's why humans are social animals, right? That's why we, exist in the nuclear family. And then when we leave our nuclear family, we have to have another one. We have to be in groups of people. And being connected to one another and having that sense of belonging somewhere is important, which is that is what is so problematic about stereotypes and expectations that might not be healthy, because that sense of belonging is so strong that you can see sometimes people making choices that are harmful to themselves as individual so that they can belong in the group.
Yeah, and so let's talk about these masculine norms that could be harmful. So just to name a few, and these were from the book that we're discussing, Boys and Sex by Peggy Orenstein, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes, and there's like a big sort of subtitle for it. So she talks specifically, a lot of it is about like hookup culture and what boys are taught about what it means to be in a relationship or not.
Yeah, and so some of these rigid masculine norms that she mentions in the book are dominance, aggression, wealth, athleticism, sexual conquest, and emotional suppression. So each one of these kind of like ring a bell and remind me of something in my history. And so for I know athleticism, when I was in high school, I was in the soccer team, and so it's a masculine norm to be in these sports. But fortunately for me, my parents were all about it. They were happy, brought me to all my practices. But I remember having some girls in my team who had to hide from their fathers, and their fathers didn't let them join this team because they were women, and girls are not supposed to play sports. And thank God for my coach. She was very involved and was able to convince these parents that it's not a bad thing for girls to be involved in sports. So that's something that just kind of pulls on my heartstrings, because I remember how difficult it was for those girls on my team to just simply convince their father that to allow them to join a soccer team that they really wanted to do.
When I hear you go over that whole list, what sticks out to me is that when I started in this work, I started in a role very similar to your role in the prevention education world. And I came in, having graduated with a women's studies degree, and those were all of the same things that I had learned about long ago. And when I was doing prevention education, it was around those things. We did this exercise, which you all might even still be doing. It's called the man box and the woman box. And it was all about kind of drawing a box. And the idea was for the youth that we were talking to say, okay, what are all of the things that boys are supposed to be, or that girls are supposed to be, and they would fill the box with those things. So that list, right, is something that you would put in the man box. All the things that men are supposed to be. And then we would go through with the exercise and say, okay, so what happens when you try to step out of the man box? And then it's all of the things that someone might say or do to you if you try to break out of that box and do something other than that. So in the case of my son, when I ask him, well, can boys do things that a girl might normally do? Oh, no, they cannot. And when first time I asked him that, I was just like, oh, it's it's been a long time that I've been doing this work, and to hear him still say the exact same thing that was
After I know you've been talking to him about this.
the same thing. And this is my little boy who, he's not standing next to me, but, when Frozen first came out, he was super excited to have an Elsa costume and be Elsa and sing the songs and, do the ice coming out of the hands, and that wasn't that long ago, So what is it, like 3 or 4 years later? Now he's saying, no way, boys can't do a thing that we think of as a girl thing. We can't step out of our box. We have our things, they have their things, and that's how it needs to be. I don't know how he's going to continue to evolve, and grow and change, which of course he will, because we all do.
Yeah, and that goes to show that everyone does play a role. You can try your hardest to teach him a certain way, but he goes to school and he watches YouTube and he watches TV, and everything else is going to tell him maybe something else. So everything just plays a role.
Yeah, well, and it really challenges some of the notions about nature versus nurture. A whole slew of me and my feminist friends were so for sure that we could raise gender neutral children, and I have folks who, they have kids my age who were so for sure that that's what this is going to be like. But at a certain point, it's how do we embrace, the true nature of who our kids are, no matter what that is, and endeavor to create conditions where they can be whole people. Like that's my goal, right? Like how do I create the conditions, if I put it in, within my small sphere of control, that he can make choices throughout his life to be a whole person, and doesn't feel this pressure that he can't do a certain thing because of what other people are going to say to him. And that's the piece when we get to how does this impact what boys might be like in their relationships.
Yes.
In this book, Peggy Ornstein, she interviews young adult men and sort of like older high school men, and that those are some of the things that they tell her about is so much pressure about how they should be, that they've restricted the way that they are in relationships, or that they can't say the things that they really feel to their male friends.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's new. I mean, I don't think that any of it is new concepts, but I think I'm just maybe reading it and looking at it now from a different lens than I used to have. But it really does make you kind of wonder, I'm a woman that chooses, I'm married to a man, so that I've got the man as my husband. I'm raising a boy that eventually will be a man. So it's like, do I have a bias? Where's my bias in all of this, right? And am I also buying into what I think they should be? It just makes you really stop and like question everything.
That is really interesting. And that's actually something that I might want to just say out loud is if we do have a bias and we happen to say it in this episode, please call us out on it, because it's something we want to know about.
Yeah.
It's something we want to know about because we would like to learn from ourselves, and we would like to learn from you all.
Well, and we all do. And I think that's the piece that in this year of all the years, with so much focus on racial injustice, that concept of implicit bias is one that is very loudly being discussed. We have implicit biases about all sorts of things. And my question keeps being, can I find the right article to tell me how I can figure out my unconscious bias, because it's unconscious? And
There should be like a test.
How do I dig into myself and figure out where it is so I can do something about it? Because I have a desire.
Exactly.
I want to be as respectful and treat people well as I possibly can. And all of us need to know what our blind spots are. And I definitely think that I've had some blind spots when it comes to that. I mean, I know that I used to be worried about if I ever had a boy and not a girl, because I really felt like I knew what to do with a girl, right? It was a women's studies major. That's like all I did was think about girls and women in the world.
Oh
And
yeah.
so I felt like I knew what to do, to not feel like I knew what to do with a boy.
Mhm.
Now that I have one, I don't know what I would do with a girl.
I can relate. Yeah.
I'm so happy. I'm so completely thrilled that I had a boy, and I love him dearly and want nothing in the world but to do as good by him as I
Yes.
possibly can, and to see him have fulfilling and loving relationships. And
Yeah.
I need to be able to learn and understand as much as possible about how I can help that happen in his life. But I don't know what it's like to grow up as a boy. So I
Yeah.
have to figure out, what do I need to be doing, and do I need to change anything?
Yeah.
And one of the pieces that really stuck out to me in this book, because it's an explicit book. I mean, it's titled Boys and Sex, and they do talk about sex in this book. And one of the things that is really clear is that these boys talk about how no one ever talked to them about sex.
Mhm.
They didn't know what to expect. They didn't know what their role was supposed to be. They didn't know how themselves, with feeling all kinds of pressure that they should be hooking up with people, they didn't know how to um, not hook up with people if they didn't really want to, because they felt a lot of pressure too. And that was a piece that was different for me. With
Yeah.
everything I have read, all the trainings that I've been to, it's not a perspective that I see lifted up very often.
I read a little bit into that, and there were a couple of things that stood out to me as well. One of the main things that stood out to me was how boys just simply refer to sex amongst each other. So when they are amongst each other and they talk about sex, they don't talk about it as this even pleasurable experience. They talk about it in a way where they're kind of bragging about how they control the woman's body and how that's all there is to it. And so that's what boys in the locker room conversation, that's what they talk about. And so they use words like I banged, I hit that, tapped that, hammered, where I think that's something that's different between boys and girls. I don't see a girl going up to her friends and saying that's all that happened. That'd be something I don't think she'd want to share. So that's something that I found very interesting.
Yeah, I
Um,
thought, I just had a thought and then I lost it a little bit.
that's happened to me a couple times.
in relation to that piece of it. Oh, that now I remember what it was. Thank you. So she was really explicit. Apparently, I haven't read it yet, but she did another book similar where she spoke to girls about the same kinds of concepts. And something that rang true for both teenage boys and teenage girls is that even if people did talk with either of them about sex, the idea that sex should be something pleasurable to both parties was something that never came into it. So again, when
Okay.
you're talking about those words, though that doesn't indicate pleasure for anyone.
Oh,
It doesn't. And I think we here in the United States we don't talk to our youth about sex nearly as much as some other countries do. There are kids who, some girls, the first time they hear anything related to sex at all is when they're going to get their period. And it's really just about how you're going to deal with that rather than anything else. So we have some expectations of how we want people to be in their relationships. Yet, so when I had a similar job of yours and I was talking about dating violence to people and educating adults, one of the first things I would say is okay, raise your hand if you got the dating handbook when you started dating. See, and they do exactly what you just did on your face, because there isn't one and nobody gets the handbook on dating, yet we're fully expecting when people begin to have formal relationships that they know how to be with each other. But nobody
yeah.
ever talks to them about it or gives license that, you know what, we're seeing that young people are having sex. Wouldn't it be nice for them to know what that's all about?
Yeah.
And that they should like it if they're going
Yeah.
to do it.
And that they deserve to, definitely.
And in the United States, that's just a really sort of mind-blowing kind of concept about it. But I got to tell you, the first time that my son is not yet 10 and has already come to me and asked me questions about sex when he was in second grade.
Oh.
And the description that he had heard was surely close enough to what it was. And so I have already started talking to him about sex because he found out about it when he was 8.
And they're going to find out about it, and there's nothing you can do. Do you
They're
want them to
going to
learn
find
it
out
from
about
you, or do you want them to learn it from who knows what, from the media and just
Yeah,
their friends?
there's another piece in Peggy Orenstein's book that was interesting to me, is that she did talk to each of the boys about the influence of pornography in their life. And when she set up this discussion, she stated in her book that she purposefully chose not to ask the boys if they had seen pornography, because it was such a given that they would have, that her question to them was, when was the first time you saw pornography? Because every single one of them had seen it. That was the parent moment in my mind where I was like, holy cow, I have to be prepared for that to happen. I don't want to see it. Look at you like, I don't want to be prepared for that to happen.
I'm not ready.
But I think this is the eye-opening, difficult. This is the difficult part.
Yeah.
If we turn the blind eye to the reality, we aren't prepared to deal with it, and we're
Exactly.
certainly not going to prepare the young boys and young men in our lives to deal with it, because what we do know is that pornography is not a realistic representation of sex or relationships, and it's hurtful for young people to consume pornography and not have any context around that and ability to discuss it and realize this is not what real life is going to be like or is
Exactly.
like. But that piece where she had to make that decision, I'm going to ask them when they first saw it rather than if they did, because she already knew they all would have seen it. That's a big
That
one.
was eye-opening. I'm wondering though if any of them wouldn't say that they haven't seen it just because the question was asked that way, but that's just a thought.
Yeah, I don't know. I believe she asked them to sort of tell the story about it.
Okay,
So
okay.
it needed to be, more like
Yeah.
not just a yes, no answer, but yes, and tell me about that.
Mhm.
Tell me more about that.
And something that I also found interesting when reading about the books is that, boys, they're willing to talk. They're willing to talk about their emotions, but they just need to find that person who's going to be non-judgmental about it. And she was able to get them to open up to her and talk about, all of these things. And that's something that reminded me of the Bro program that we have here in our agency. So we have a 8-week program for boys. And that first week, these boys are usually, they don't say anything. They hardly even want to be there. But after a while, they start opening up. They start realizing that, oh, these people do want to hear me. They're not judging me. We also tell them whatever we talk about in groups stays in groups. So nobody else is going to go out and tell the rest of their friends what has been discussed in our group. And everybody agrees to that. So that actually helps. And then after a while, they don't even want group to end because they want to talk about all their feelings, and they want to talk about the things that have happened. And so that's something that I notice is they do open up, and they want to, and they're willing to, but they're not just going to do it to anybody. Mm-hmm. And so we even do a check-in. So right when the class starts, we ask them how they're feeling. And so this goes back to the feelings where they can only feel angry or happy. So we ask them how they're feeling, and usually those are the two they use. Okay. And usually that's it. We don't allow those. We give them a whole list of feelings, a whole poster of feelings, and they go through them, and they usually name about 5 of them. Well, I'm feeling this and I'm feeling that. And so by week 8, they're able to use those feelings more without using the poster.
Isn't that amazing? I found that as adults as well. We had done at a previous job, we did some training around nonviolent communication. And part of that is learning how to communicate to someone, right? When you've been when you need to give them feedback about an experience. And, the sentence is sort of like, when you blank, I feel. And we have like 5 feelings generally that are go-tos. So we had to have a
Yeah.
list. This packet had the whole list that you could look through and they like, okay, what is my feeling? How can I get as specific as possible with it?
Isn't that something, even in adults?
Yeah, because we stick it, we're mad, sad, angry, I might be embarrassed,
Mhm.
and maybe that those are kind of the go-tos.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something that we focus on with the little ones. So it's interesting that you say that, I can see myself. If you ask me how am I feeling, I'm going to probably choose one of those 5, unless I have the list in front of me. But we talk to the little ones about feelings and how it's okay to feel whatever type of feeling. But usually even the little ones go straight to feeling angry, but there's something behind this anger that's something else. There's other feelings.
Yeah, there's a wheel that I found. I scan Pinterest when I have nothing, that I'm sitting by myself. And there's a wheel in there that's similar to this, where it has kind of the core feelings are sort of tighter in the wheel. And as it goes out, it sort of like has associated feelings that are a little bit more specific. So I found that really helpful. Sometimes we'll look at it and it's like, okay, if it's one of those core ones, let's say, okay, well, where else is it? Are you really sad, or is there more going on? And it kind of helps to look at that a little bit more.
So let's talk about this hookup culture, the term hookup culture, and what it kind of sort of means. And I say kind of sort of because it's very ambiguous.
Yeah, it sounds like that means, different things for different people, which, right, that's how a lot of that kind of pop culture words are. I think hookup culture probably looked different for me when I was a teenager, and you when you were a teenager. And then the folks, that she was talking about in the book. But this different idea of a hookup versus a relationship. And what was interesting is that she definitely was able to contrast some of the boys and young men that she talked to, talking about hookup culture and someone that they may have hooked up with in a certain way. But if they were in a relationship, being able to really talk about their partner in a completely different way from someone that maybe they would have hooked up with. And it seemed to appear that the boys and young men that she talked to defined a hookup on a full range, either from having sex with someone to maybe, kissing and making out with someone. So it really was a subjective definition depending on who she was talking to.
Okay, interesting. Another thing I found interesting is that, it's kind of like status seeking when they use that term.
Yeah, I was
So
gonna say that it was sort of related to social status, or this expectation.
Exactly.
That people are going to hook up and that they're going to talk about it afterwards. And this idea of who the status of the person you hooking up with impacting your status. And that was sort of, I think there was at least one that she spoke to that ended up, I believe that he was drunk. And I think that he was passed out, or he was so drunk that the next day he didn't remember that he was engaged in a sexual act with someone, and found out later and was like, I really didn't want that to happen. But also at the same time, didn't say that to his male friends and peer group because he knew that they would expect him to want to hook up anyway.
Yeah.
So kept that experience to himself.
Yeah. And so this idea that guys are always down for it, that kind of makes me think, how many of them actually had unwanted sex and just didn't tell anybody that they didn't like it. They didn't want to do it, but it's expected of them to always want to.
Yeah. And I think this is a piece that we've been slowly growing toward learning more about in the field, and the kind of work that we do is really having to be more open to, again, all of the experiences of people, and not always looking at a young man as only the one who could possibly hurt someone, but being able to be open to the fact that this person could also be hurt in a relationship with someone else, and they also deserve to be able to talk to someone about it. And then also this idea, there's a whole part in the book that I think it's called Better Man, or no, I think that might be the chapter, but somewhere within the subchapter, it's From Monster to Man, which really reminded me so much of like our PAPE program, and the
Oh.
things that, Ruben talks about sometimes when he's been on this show. But this whole, it was just a particular case study that she went through, but the possibility of someone being able to recognize and learn from harm that they've caused, and understand that that's one thing that she's warns about. Her very last chapter is for parents, and prepping and talking about how adults need to talk to boys, young boys and older boys, about sex and relationships in very open and frank kinds of ways, because of this idea. I mean, I came into this work, from sexual assault prevention. So in my mind, I'm thinking like, yeah, what, all of us, right, doing dating violence and sexual assault prevention, all of us would, what if one of our children assaulted someone? What if? Because we're
Yeah,
thinking,
there's-
and then what do you do?
exactly.
Because
Yeah.
all of these young people that we hear about having assaulted that is someone's child.
Yeah.
And
And how did they get that idea?
do and right, and what do you do? There was one study that I read, I can't remember how long ago it was, but they were saying that the boys and young men that they talked to in this study knew that they couldn't basically, like, go up to a stranger and rape a stranger in an alley, but that's kind of the only thing they knew they couldn't do. And in this book, one of the, when you do audiobooks, you can do like a little bookmark clip. You can cut out a clip of it. And I cut out this clip where she talked about, talking a lot about consent and what does consent mean, but also the concept that consent is kind of a low bar if that's the only thing that we're expecting, if that's the only thing that we're saying is okay. You've got to get consent, period. But back to this idea though, but shouldn't it go beyond that?
Yeah.
What is,
Yeah.
and she talked about this idea of ethical relationships and ethical sex, that we shouldn't just, we've put a law into consent, and of course you have to get consent, but so does it stop at yes?
Exactly. And that's something that I believe it was the last episode last week was on consent. And I liked that it was mentioned that, it doesn't just stop at that. It's not just, okay, well, she or he said yes, and now I'm free to do whatever I want. No, it's consent for every step. It's consent every step of the way. And you can always go back and you can go forth. And there's more to it than just a yes.
And this concept of, just because you give consent, it also doesn't mean that you're going to be concerned about your pleasure or the other person's pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that too.
Because you can still say yes to sex and not like it, or have it not be fun, or, have it be a poor experience. And then, so are we teaching our children, this was an awful experience. I didn't like it at all. I feel not good about it at the end, but I said yes. So there's nothing I can do about it now. I'm not sure that's a lesson that we really want to be teaching.
I know, and something should be done differently. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about our children and as parents. I know we've covered that a little bit. What can we do as parents to kind of stray away from this and to help this situation? So basically talking about it, right?
Yeah. So I think we're all learning, I'm learning, you're learning. So we're not coming at this.
We're learning as we go.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know that I'm sure you do this because you talk about emotions with young kids, but always trying to have that full range of emotions open, and validating when when your children show emotion, that any kind of emotion is okay. The sometimes behavior associated with an emotion might not be okay, like hitting or throwing or whatnot, but the emotion itself is always okay
Yeah,
and
no
always
matter what it is.
valid.
Yeah, and that's
And
something that I feel has actually helped me out as a parent, is knowing that. Is knowing that, you know, my kids can feel anything and that's fine. And I usually go and ask them, what is it that you're feeling? So that's also something that we can do from early on, is just ask them, how are you feeling? And honestly, just them saying out loud the emotion that they feel helps them relieve some stress. It helps them feel a little bit better, just knowing what they're feeling.
yeah, and I think validating emotions in all circumstances. And now that my son is getting older, encouraging him to tell his friends.
Mhm.
You know, he's at that age where sometimes interactions with friends aren't awesome and they aren't always nice to each other. So it's, you know, and helping him to dig into that a little bit and be able to communicate, you know, when those interactions are problematic and why. And then, you know, when I overhear something, you know, maybe that he does, you know, being able to say, hey, you know, you did this or you said this, and we
Yeah.
need to talk about why that could be problematic. And then I dug out a book right before we got on here because, like I said, I had realized when my son had come home from school and was asking questions I was not prepared to answer. I said, "Well, I better, you know, do as much as I can to prep him for this." So I went through. There's an author, and I am not entirely sure of the pronunciation of the first name. The name is spelled Robie. So it's either Robbie or Roby. I'm not sure. Harris. And this author has 3 books, and it's for different age groups and age appropriately teaching ideas about your own body and sex. And this is the one that's in his age group. It's called It's So Amazing, and it's super awesome. And we've went through and read the whole book together to answer all of those questions. It's the subtitle is a book about eggs, sperm, birth, babies, and families. So for younger kids, you know, there's always this idea of how young is too young to start talking to your kids about sex and consent, and they're never too young. So as soon as my little boy was old enough to be able to grasp a washcloth, I taught him how to wash his penis and his butt himself, because he needs to know and understand that those parts of his body are for him to take care of, and that he has the right
Yeah.
to tell someone not to touch him. And he has the right to learn from a very early age that, you know, your penis and your butt are yours. You get to
Yeah.
decide what you do with them.
Mhm.
And to slowly start to move towards, you know, privacy with him as he gets older, and about how to take care of himself. So kind of stepping up, you know,
Yeah.
all of those discussions about some of that kind of stuff. And I haven't yet figured out, you know, the next step. Like, how do we
Yeah.
go to the next phase? What do we talk about next? But I know I have to do it, because how else is he going to learn? Who is he going to learn it from? And am I okay with the answer
Yeah.
to that question?
I think I'm thinking that we'll know when it's time for that next step, because that's something that I do as well. I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, and that's something that I've always done ever since, you know, they were able to wash themselves, is always ask them for permission, you know, because usually I do take them a bath
Yeah.
myself, and I ask them, is it okay if I wash this part? Is it okay if I wash that? And usually they say no. Usually they say, just because they're giving that choice, they're like, nope, I'll do it. Especially my
That's such a
3-year-old,
sweet
who's like, I can do things
example.
by myself.
Yeah, and I love that example of letting them have that power over their body. And sometimes as adults, we don't do that, particularly with young kids. And they do need to learn that they have the right to say no,
Mhm.
to an adult, because unfortunately, and this is kind of going off the side a little bit, I think, of our topic, but the average age for sexual abuse of children is 9 years old.
Oh,
That's
wow.
the average age for onset of sexual abuse for children. So that means it's often starting when children are much younger than that. And it's most likely going to be someone who is already close to the child in
Mhm.
some kind of way. So it is imperative that children know that it is okay to say no to an adult, even someone that they love and trust, and we have to teach them when someone is going to touch their private parts. I talk about, I have to be able to look and see if you're hurt or something's wrong. The doctor has to be able to look and see if you're hurt, is something wrong, and I'll be there when that happens so that we can talk about it. And we have, been in the doctor's office, for the physicals, and he's like, hey, and I said, well, and we talk about it, and he has to say yes. It's okay to teach those boundaries to
Definitely.
kids. And it's not about disrespecting someone. It's about teaching them from a young age how to respect themselves and to empower them to do that. And it's the same idea with consent. So we really practice consent around tickling, because I feel like that's good, like every day, every way.
I was hoping you brought that up because I loved that.
To teach a child about consent, because that's another one that feels like a rough concept of how do you teach a kid about, because we think so much about consent related to sex and not consent related to just about anything. So
Yeah.
for us, my husband and I, if we're tickling or playing with our son and he says to stop, we stop. Even if we think he's just saying it, we stop and we say, do you really want me to stop, or
Mhm.
should we keep going? And that gives him the chance to say, yes, you can do it more. Or even when I'm giving kisses on the cheek and he says, stop, then I stop. Do you want me to stop kissing you, or can I give you more kisses on the cheek? Because I'm a mom, and I do what he asks me to do, because this is how he's learning the difference between yes or no and what consent means. And ever since he was little, when they were in preschool and they would hug each other and, maybe they would knock each other over, we'd be like, wait, does your friend want you to hug them? Does your friend want the hug? Your friend has to want the hug. Or when he would jokingly say how he was going to marry so-and-so, I would say, well, so-and-so has to want to marry you.
Yeah.
So little ways to kind of put that in there, because we all have choices every day. And
Exactly.
there's ways we can weave that in. But I think it's easier with younger children. What I'm concerned about is when it's older and people are, my husband and I are going to have to explicitly talk to my son about sex. I haven't crossed that bridge yet. That's definitely going to be a lot more uncomfortable than stopping tickling him when he says no.
Yeah.
A whole other ball game.
I agree. And something that that reminds me of is what we talked about before, is how so in my family, we are very, I guess you would say, touchy, maybe. When I go and visit my family, most people, at least most of the ladies in my family, expect me to give them a hug and a kiss. That's how I was raised, and that's our tradition. But now that I have children and I go visit our family, they expect them to do the same thing, which I think they should have the choice to. If they want to go and give somebody a hug and a kiss, it's up to them whether they want to or not. So it could get difficult though with different cultures. And sometimes that's deemed as, you're being rude. You didn't go give your aunt a hug and a kiss. You didn't kiss grandma. And so this kid is being rude. But, it can get difficult. Even these things that we want to teach our kids are not always that easy. But it's however you want to raise your kids, it's just up to you. But that's what I decided to do, is every time we go out, I let them choose. If you want to kiss your family and give them a hug, that's up to you. But no matter how many times they say you got to come hug me and kiss me, no, they can always say no.
Yeah, I think it's really important. That's important to recognize and point out that it isn't necessarily going to be easy,
Right.
if that's what you're choosing.
Exactly. But really good advice. Jennifer, thank you for being here on Tea with us today. Thank you for all your knowledge. We always love having you here. Conversations with you are always so interesting. And we could
I
go on
always
and
hope
on.
I'm going to say the right thing. I always come into tea and I think I know what I'm going to say. And then I like 5 minutes before, I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to do.
Sometimes it does go in a different direction. We expect it to go this way, but it's always good information, especially here with you. So are there any last words that you'd like to say before we go on to the questions?
I think just that idea of getting to a place where we all can be comfortable to talk to the young men and boys in our lives very openly and honestly about relationships, about romantic relationships, and about sex. So like I said, I mean, I'm learning this with every single person who's watching it right now. But I know that's what we need to do because we're invested, right, in the boys and young men in our lives being able to have wonderfully awesome relationships.
Yes. And that conversation is not always going to be easy. In fact, it probably is not going to be easy, but it's definitely a must-have. So, Zach, can you let us know if there are any questions in the comment section so far?
So we do not have any questions. We do have some supportive comments.
Okay.
So if anyone has a last second question, that would be a great time, but I'll let you have it back for right now.
Thank you, Zach. Yeah, so if anybody thinks of any questions, we can always answer them in the comment section, but that's about all we have for today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for Celeste for doing this with me and for agreeing to talk about it from that point of view of, you know, parents raising boys and all of the things that are running through our minds, because I'm sure we're not alone.
No, definitely not. Thank you, Jennifer, for being here with us. And we hope to see you guys next week, same time, same place, different tea. Goodbye.
Bye.